We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Is that going to
Solo quiere el triunfo de México.
Ernesto Cedillo was Mexico's president for 6 years, serving from 1994 to 2000. A trained economist, he brought in what were described as profound electoral reforms, which in effect ended the traditional hold his Institutional Revolutionary Party, the PRI, had on the presidency. Faced with a financial crisis just days after taking office, he brought in a series of changes and economic reforms which helped the country recover. Yet he's probably best remembered for the creation of the Progresa program, which helped some of Mexico's poorest families with subsidies and support as long as their children went to school. Since leaving office, he's spent a lot of time concentrating on globalization and its impacts on the links between developed and developing nations. He's currently the director of the Center for the Study of Globalization at Yale University in the US. As his home country struggles with continuing drug violence, murders, kidnappings and corruption, he served on the Global Commission on Drug Policy. It has called for a fundamental rethink across the world. We'll discuss all of this as the former president of Mexico talks to Al Jazeera. Ernesto Cedillo, thank you very much indeed for talking to Al Jazeera. Do you think your time in charge in Mexico changed the face of the country?
Well, I haven't thought about that. The country changes every day. And of course, during my time, there were big challenges. And some of them were overcome during my time as president. But there are always pending tasks and huge challenges to be undertaken. So I don't think I have made a balance of which ones were achieved or not. So I don't really have a... Of course, the country changed, and I hope for the better.
How do you think history will remember you when it comes to your presidency?
I don't think about those things, really. I don't really... history is the job of historians, not of former politicians and present professors of economics as myself.
There are those who say that you changed the face of the country because you essentially changed the way that the voting structure, you challenged the authority of your own party, and that led to the loss of the presidency for the first time in a very long time to the other side. When you called Vicente Fox to say congratulations, you've won, how difficult a call was that to make, or did you feel that was the right thing at that point?
Well, I think your question involves several issues. One, a major electoral comprehensive reform on the electoral issues was long overdue in my country. And we achieved that, but it was not just my achievement. Other forces, other powers in the Mexican state participated, and we did it under the impulse of Mexican civil society. So I would not take particular credit for that. I think it was a collective credit, a collective achievement, and the consequence was that the playing field, the political playing field was level for all parties to compete with resources and with the right access to the media, and also having all the legal security that votes will be counted right. So I think that was a big undertaking. It was never planned to have any candidate or any particular party to win, but rather to have whoever the people decided to win. And that's what happened. So for me, it was not traumatic or difficult to accept the decision of the people. I think what was difficult was to achieve the political reform, but I insist it was not only my merit, but it was a collective merit.
Do you think those democratic reforms still exist today in Mexico? Do you still believe that the crux of what was created at that time with yourself and Mexican civil society still burns in Mexico today?
I think so, definitely. I think we have now achieved what I would call, in terms of electoral legality and processes, a normal democracy. And that has not been weakened. in any way. In fact, I think people are learning and still learning, and I think in that aspect, the Mexican democracy is very strong. I think one consequence, which even before the 2000 election we had, was to really count with real checks and balances. In 1997, halfway my term, there were congressional elections, and we lost the majority, the absolute majority, my party, in the lower chamber of Congress. And from that moment, I think history was changed. It was not in 2000, actually. It was in 1997, because for the first time, we really had effective congressional checks on the executive branch. And I think the country has continued like that. No party has dominated Congress ever since 1997. So I think we have that checks and balances that we didn't have before, and that makes a lot for the political and the democratic life of the country.
When you walked into the presidency, of course, you had a number of issues to deal with, some significant issues, not least the economic climate. Did it help as an economist you could plot your way through that, or was it made more difficult because, as we know, give an economist a problem and there's always two answers?
That's right. Well, I think it was an advantage to be an economist because I could realize once I was in office very soon how difficult the situation was. And I had been very well trained at not only at a school, but at the central bank and at the positions I had in government about the economy and the Mexican economy. And I think that gave me really an asset to realize rather soon how dramatically difficult the situation was. And that certainly fed my conviction that we have to tackle that crisis right away with an overwhelming set of decisions, because otherwise the situation would have gotten totally out of control.
Do you think the devaluation was still the right decision?
Well, you know, the devaluation was not a decision, and that's sometimes a mistake that people make. When you have run out of international reserves, when actually your international reserves are negative, which was a situation I had at the beginning of my administration, then pretend that you can fix the exchange rate in any level is absolutely absurd. I mean, it is the force of events, the fact that you no longer can keep any exchange rate because you don't have reserves. I mean, you have to deal with that. So it's not a decision, really. I mean, it's a decision to the extent that you have to accept reality, and that was the reality at that moment. But I think the important thing is to take the decision, but then say this comes with a package of actions with other instruments of economic policy to make whatever happens in the foreign exchange market eventually to constitute a way out of the crisis. And that's what we did. We did a program of very significant fiscal and monetary adjustment, and we had to confront also the fact that the financial system for practical purposes was broken.
Those adjustments also led to many businesses going bust, to thousands of people losing their job. Some people say it also led to mass migration from Mexico because of the financial situation. Do you think that's a fair assessment of some of the implications and some of the consequences of that decision?
I think the difficult circumstances that Mexico went through in 94 and 95 were consequence of the crisis. The decisions were decisions to confront the crisis and to fix the situation. And after 95, the Mexican economy had a period of 5 years with the highest GDP growth in its recent history. So I think that's a very clear evidence that the decisions that had to be taken did work to address the crisis and to put the country back
One of the other issues you had to confront, of course, was one that exists today, and that is the power of the cartels. Do you think that the drug cartels are still as strong and as insidious in Mexican public life as they have been from the time that you became president?
No, they are much more powerful. No, I mean, the problem we had to deal with was relatively minor as compared with the situation that Mexico is facing. Unfortunately, as other countries were successful in mitigating the drug problem, the problem grew in Mexico to incredible proportions. So what happens today is a huge problem, many times the problem that I had to confront when I was in office, by any indicator, not least the violence that unfortunately my country has endured over the last 8 years.
Could you have been braver when you were president in taking on the cartels? Could you have done more that would perhaps have stifled the power that they have now?
Well, I think the answer to that question, I would be a little bit careful. I think in retrospect, I should have been more insisting in saying, as I did it back then, and I say it today, that the so-called war on drugs, as it was conceived many years ago, had failed. And now we have proof, further proof, that the way in which we have dealt with the drug problem for so many years is a total failure. So I would say I would have put more emphasis on this, but also in retrospect, it would have been better to start working even harder on strengthening the rule of law in Mexico.
So what do you do?
Well, I think you have to do many things. Of course, my country must work harder on strengthening the rule of law, because that's an issue whether we had or not the drug problem. That's an issue, and that we need for other development reasons. So that's job number one. But along with that, I think we have to be more forceful with our partners in saying, we are following the wrong strategy. We have to adopt a different paradigm. We have to start thinking about the drug problem first and foremost as a health issue, right? And we have to think very seriously how to undermine and eventually banish the black market that fits these criminal organizations. So what we have done in this Global Commission on Drug Policy is to propose a new approach, which has many aspects, but I would say, put it in a nutshell, is number one, the world should have a new international legal framework by which countries should have the freedom, the legal freedom, to decriminalize the consumption of drugs on the one hand, and on the other, legally regulate drug markets. Because what we have done is simply to fit organized crime with this rather stupid policy.
How far does that go? Do you decriminalize cocaine? Do you decriminalize heroin? We're seeing that marijuana is now being made available in parts of the United States. It's been decriminalized in places like Holland, the Netherlands, for a very long time. How far do you take that policy?
Well, I mean, this is not the place to make a drug-by-drug analysis, but I think the principle should be clear. You want to decriminalize, you don't want to put people in jail because they consume drugs. That's very important, because that's ridiculous. I mean, you deal with drug addictions as a medical problem, not as a criminal problem. And what has happened is a disaster, because you have millions and millions of people in jail for drug offenses. And you should have those people in hospitals, not in jails, right? And second, you don't want to simply decriminalize consumption without doing something with the supply of drugs. And there, the big umbrella or the big concept is to regulate the supply of drugs. And of course, you cannot treat one drug the same as the other. You have to do it, based on science and medical criteria. You have to define ways to deal with every single drug. There is an approach for alcohol, there is an approach for tobacco. Now some countries are experiencing with approaches with marijuana. And I think under the medical advice, we have to find ways, and taking into account the conditions of every country, you have to define a regulation framework for every kind of drug. Now, this may sound awkward, but it isn't. If you think about it, countries regulate literally thousands of medical drugs that if you simply consume them freely, probably you could die, right? But we have a system of regulation. We have a system of prescriptions, we have systems of pharmacy, we have hospitals, and we do it for thousands of drugs. And the question is why not doing it for non-medical drugs? I think it can be done.
But there is a political will not to take it too far. I mean, there are people who object even to marijuana being made legal in certain states in the United States, for example. If you wish to extend that, even though the argument is there and it's a sound argument and something that's been articulated for a very long time, how do you win over the people who are politically believe that that is not what their constituents, what their party wants?
Well, I think we need, first of all, to make information accessible to citizens. I think we have to have a very serious dialogue and deliberation by which the information of what has happened with this war on drugs, what has happened over time, and to offer that information that allows people to have a better, well-informed, better educated judgment.
How do you address, though, the vested interests? There are people who own prisons who like to see them full, whether or not they're catering for people who commit mass murder or whether they commit an offensive possession of cannabis. How do you overcome
You have to expose the facts the same way you are doing it. I wish, many journalists, we had many journalists like you who said that in public, said, we know that there is a prison lobby in the US, but maybe other interests in other countries that of course don't want things to change because they are benefiting personally from this status quo. But I think the first step is to explain that to people, to let people know that when there have been campaigns to have more rational policies in some states, the prison lobby in this country has paid the campaigns against that more progressive positions. And I think that's a big role for journalists to say, okay, who is paying for this? I mean, why are they doing it? What is the profit they get? That's the way to go.
Some governments have benefited as well because they follow the line that's set by the United States and therefore they get grants, for want of a better word, to help in the fight against drugs. And so financially it's in their interest to continue.
A rather Pyrrhic victory, because ultimately what governments want is to have less violence, less corruption, less undermining of institutions. And it is not about having more or less aid to fight organized crime. What the governments want is not to have organized crime. And if you have it, well, you want to have an organized crime that doesn't have the huge resources provided by drug trafficking.
There are those who have sought to sue Zedillo over the 1997 Acteal massacre, when 45 people attending a prayer meeting were killed by a paramilitary group. But supporters claim the court case was politically motivated and the US Supreme Court refused to hear it. You continue to study globalization at Yale, and it would be remiss if I didn't mention the protests that we've seen at Yale because of the Acteal massacre, and people believe that you have played a part in that. What would you say to the critics that believe that you should be in a courtroom answering questions about your role in what happened there, the death of 45 men, women and children?
Well, at the time that terrible tragedy happened in Mexico, there was a thorough investigation of why that had happened, this dispute between two groups. The federal government was extremely proactive in procuring justice, although originally was a local matter. The federal government, the federal attorney general, went into Chiapas, investigated, and the perpetrators of that terrible massacre were put in jail. So I think the Mexican government did the right thing at the time.
You feel you have no questions to answer about your role in Actel?
Well, I think the Mexican government, at the time I was presiding the Mexican government, not only answer all the questions, but also make sure that justice was made.
Given your criticism of the G20 and other international organisations, given the continuing war on drugs, do you remain optimistic about what may happen to the global economy and to the nations of the world over the next 10, 15, 20 years?
Well, of course, we must be optimistic and we must be positive without ignoring the enormous difficulties that are being confronted. I think we have to look back to the problems that countries have been dealing with in the last century. And we have to recognize that there have been significant achievements, but there have been also significant failures. But I think the positive has to be taken as a lesson to keep pursuing new strategies, new approaches, better policies, and in particular, better international coordination. I insist we cannot have the benefits of increasing integration and interdependence and simply ignore that with it there are other issues that have to be dealt with.
And who pays for that? Is it the poor of the world? Is there a better life outside of their current existence for them with increasing globalization?
Well, I think that's the wrong statement. I think a lot of poor people in the world, millions and millions of people, can benefit from the opportunities provided by the market economy, not only at the global level, but also at the local level. We humans have not invented a better system to produce, to distribute what is produced than the market economy. At the same time, you cannot have a vigorous market economy without strong governments and without a strong rule of law and without policies that actually redistribute some of the benefits of economic growth and also actively level the playing field for economic actors. I think governments do have a role in equalizing opportunities, not equalizing results, because the results are going to depend very much on every individual's effort. But I think governments do have the responsibility to make sure that every citizen has an opportunity in this system. And I think that's where the big failure has come, to believe that the invisible hand is going to level the playing field is absolutely wrong. You need governments active pursuing that equality of opportunities. And that implies not only political decision, but also resources that you have to take somewhere from societies, and usually the ones who can afford to do it, and use wisely, intelligently, those resources to support those that need the support.
Mr. President, thank you very much indeed for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure.